Hello all and welcome back to Communication Station. As always, I am your host, Lexi Oliver, and here we post weekly on our channel discussing different communication theories. So now this week we'll be diving into social judgment theory. And right now you may be thinking, hey, I went to high school, I know plenty about social judgment. But actually, this theory goes a lot deeper into the judgments we make. For example, we could take politicians and how they organize their campaigns in order to appeal to the largest number of people in order to win. Now, what is social judgment theory? In the textbook, a first look at communication theory written by M. Griffin, who has a PhD from Northwestern University and has been a professor at Wheaton College for over 30 years, along with others, published this textbook in 2012, states that the definition of this theory is, quote, the subconscious sorting out of ideas that occurs at the instant of perception. We weigh every new idea by comparing it with our present point of view, end quote. So what does this mean in a little bit of simpler terms? We can think of social judgment theory as a scale your brain uses to interpret every new idea or opinion. So basically, our minds are not able to think of an idea objectively. If you ever think back to maybe when people say, take your bias out of things or something like that, you can't actually do that because you compare every new idea to what you actually believe, creating a judgment. In the textbook, A First Look at Communication Theory, written by M. Griffin that I mentioned earlier, it says that this theory was primarily developed by Muzaffer Sherif with help from his colleagues Carolyn Sherif, Carl Hovland, and Roger Nebergall in the early 1960s. Sherif, who was a social psychologist at the University of Oklahoma and graduated with a doctorate from Columbia University, was able to join us today. You may be thinking, Lexi, what? He died. But you can't imagine the things people will do to get on this podcast. Anyway, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Sherif.
Hello.
Hello, Dr. Sherif. I'm so happy to have you on my podcast. Alright, so let's just dive into it. So when you were creating this theory in the early 1960s, what were you doing?
As outlined in the book that me and my wife, Carolyn, wrote during this time, I was a professor of psychology and the director of the Institute of Group Relations at the University of Oklahoma. The book that my wife, Carolyn, and I published in 1961, titled Social Judgment, Assimilation, and Contrast Effects in Communication and Attitude Change, was where the theory was first outlined, and we worked on it in the late 1950s and early 1960s.
Yes, well, that is what we're here to talk about. I understand that at this time you were well known for something else before you published your work.
Yes, that would be the Robbers Cave experiment.
Can you talk a little bit more about this experiment?
Of course. In a book written by myself and the University of Oklahoma Institute of Public Relations, published in 1961, titled Intergroup Conflict and Cooperation, the Robbers Cave Experiment, also shares this if you want to look at that later. So, this experiment took place in 1954, exploring intergroup conflicts and their resolutions. So there were two groups of 12-year-old boys with similar backgrounds. Two groups were made to compete, creating tension between the two groups, but were then made to work together, resolving some of the tension.
Wow, so it's like a toned-down version of Lord of the Flies.
Exactly.
So this theory was developed in the early 1960s in the US. What drove you to create this theory?
Well, as you can tell with my work with the Robbers Cave experiment, that social polarization is interesting to me, and this was during a time of much social polarization, the end of the Cold War and Civil Rights Movement. While I'm telling you this is also outlined in the beginning of my book, the Social Judgment, Assimilation, and Contrast Effects in Communication and Attitude Change, published in 1961. My research branches off of work from Carl Hovland and his examination after World War II into the approaches to attitude and communication, thus leading to the creation of my theory.
Also, am I to understand that after your publication of your book in 1961, this theory became popular shortly after?
Yes, well, as shown in the article Social Judgment Theory, published in 2020 and written by Caitlin Coffrey, published by EBSCO, this theory is particularly significant because it changed the focus of persuasion research to cognitive processing of messages rather than just the mechanics of message delivery. It created the idea of how the same message can be rejected by one person and accepted by another.
So that's why you created this theory, to better understand why different people react differently
to the same message. Essentially, since the majority of focus was on the message itself, the theory changed that, causing the focus to be on the individuals and their judgment of the message. This allows for people to shift their messages depending on the person. Well, Dr. Shira, it has been great having you on my podcast. Thank you for your contribution to this theory. Yes, thank you for having me. All right, so now that we know more about this theory and its origin, let's look at how this theory works. In the textbook, first look at communication theory that I mentioned earlier. Outlines that there is an anchor and 3 zones. The anchor is a position that represents the person's point of view, anchoring their judgment on ideas, essentially. So the 3 zones are the latitude of acceptance, rejection, and non-commitment. Latitude of acceptance is basically the range of ideas a person sees as reasonable, centering around the anchor. The latitude of non-commitment is kind of a gray area, where ideas aren't necessarily accepted or objected. Lastly, there's the latitude of rejection, where within this range of ideas, the person sees these as unreasonable and objectifiable. Another important aspect of this theory is the ego involvement, which basically means how important and impactful this idea is to a person's life, kind of like their closeness to the topic. So when an idea is in the latitude of rejection, this can cause the anchor to shift even further away from the idea than it was before. This also happens within the latitude of acceptance. However, the anchor can shift closer to the idea. So you may be thinking, how could I use this in my own research, but are unsure how? Well, I was kind of thinking that if you want to do this in research, you'd have to think of every person involved, and you'd have to think about their ego involvement and their anchor. You can then use the same idea or different ideas approach to these people and see how this changes their anchor. However, if you aren't a researcher and you're thinking of ways you could apply this more to your everyday life, I'm going to provide some examples that gives you an idea how this can be used. Obviously, you can probably tell from the definition and explanation of this theory that this is commonly used in politics, so I'm going to draw a couple examples from this. So the first example I'm going to bring up will be if you're having a conversation with someone who has an opposing opinion. In this example, I'm going to be choosing, let's say you are pro-choice and you're talking to someone who is pro-life. You can likely assume that this person has religious beliefs, and their anchor centers on the idea that all life is created by God and sent by God. You couldn't counter this idea with the opinion that God isn't real and women should have their own choices, which would be in the latitude of rejection for this person, which can make their anchor shift even further from the argument that you're trying to make. Rather, you should try to get into their latitude of acceptance. So maybe trying to counter that God created free will, so women can have their own choice in that way, even if you believe it's not right and not what God wanted. So another example is the polarization of parties used by politicians. So this one's pretty common, and obviously you can think of a couple ideas yourself. But I'm going to think of if a news anchor for a particular political party said that the Democratic Party wants to give all employed people in the U.S. a check for $500 every month, regardless of their unemployment. Someone who hears this and thinks that maybe unemployed people who lost their job to the economy or got fired for reasons other than how they were should receive a check. But they hear this and they think this is way not okay, and it's going to be in their latitude of rejection, and it's going to shift their anchor away from this idea. This could result in them having the opinion that no one should receive unemployment. This can then be used by the opposing party to prey on. Alrighty, thank you for tuning into the podcast. Make sure you come back next week to learn more about communication theory.